"Get lost, beggar. Go find a different pier to haunt." The words, spoken by a young man whose voice dripped with manufactured charm and disdain, cut through the clamor of the tourist dock. I could smell his expensive cologne and the chemical scent of boat wax from his gleaming vessel, the City Lights. He was Captain Rick, a man who saw the harbor as a backdrop for his business, and I was just an unsightly relic in his perfect picture. His hand on my shoulder wasn't kind. It was the condescending pressure one uses to move an object. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks as his customers tittered nervously, their silent agreement a physical blow. To them, I was just a blind man in old clothes, a piece of human driftwood. As I walked away, the sound of their laughter followed me like a foul wake. But nobody imagined what I would do that day. If this phrase reminded you of someone, just comment with, "I understand." My name is Elijah. I'm 50 years old, but if you ask me, I've lived 100 lifetimes on this water. My life isn't measured in years, but in the turning of tides, the shift of the wind, the low groan of a ship leaving its berth. This New York harbor, it's not just a place to me. It's my memory. It's my eyes. My father and his father were harbor pilots. They taught me to read the water not as a surface, but as a living, breathing creature with moods and secrets. I was supposed to be one of them, to guide the great ships through these channels, until an accident on a foggy night stole the light from my world. It took my sight, but it gave me something else. A way of listening, a feeling that goes deeper than vision. I can feel the change in current through the vibrations in the wood of the pier. I can smell a coming storm hours before the sky turns gray. But to men like Captain Rick, I'm not the legacy of a family that mastered this harbor. I'm just a piece of the scenery they wish they could tear down. An old man in worn clothes, a blind relic, debris. The humiliation is a constant tide of its own. It's not always as loud as Rick shouting at me to get lost. Sometimes it's a quiet poison. I'll be sitting on my usual bench, feeling the sun on my face, mapping the harbor in my mind through its symphony of sounds, and I'll hear the whispers. The mothers pulling their children a little closer as they pass. The soft, pitying clicks of tongues from tourists who see a tragedy, not a man. They see a void where my eyes should be, and they assume the rest of me is empty too. I remember one day last fall, a nasty squall was brewing out in the Atlantic. The air got heavy, the pressure dropped in a way that made the bones in my hands ache. I could smell the ozone, that sharp, clean scent of lightning on its way, long before the first clouds gathered. Rick was loading up a bachelorette party onto the City Lights, all of them laughing and shimmering in their party dresses. I just stood near the gangplank and said, my voice quiet, "Wind's turning sharp, Captain. That squall's coming faster than the forecast says. Best stay close to shore." He stopped, looked at me, and then a wide, mocking grin spread across his face. He turned to the giggling women. "Don't mind him, ladies," he announced, his voice booming for his audience. "He's our local weather vane, a bit rusty, but he points which way the wind blows, eventually." They all laughed. It wasn't cruel laughter, not really. It was just thoughtless, dismissive, the kind of laughter that erases you. It made me feel like an object, a piece of broken equipment on the dock. I just turned and walked away. The sting of that moment, of being turned into a joke, was worse than the cold wind that followed. Another time, a tourist dropped her expensive sunglasses through the slats of the pier. I heard the whole thing. The light plastic clatter as they slipped from her hand, and then the specific singular plink as they hit a wooden crossbeam just above the waterline, not 2 feet down. She was frantic. I tried to help. "Ma'am," I said, pointing with my cane toward the sound. "They're not in the water. They're caught on the second piling support, just under the third plank from the edge." Just then, Rick swaggered over, drawn to the commotion. "Don't listen to him," he said to the woman, his voice dripping with that false, syrupy charm. "He wouldn't know. Let me get my deckhand to fish around for them." He made a whole performance out of it, the young kid poking a long hook uselessly into the dark water, all while I sat there, knowing exactly where her glasses were. They never found them. The woman left, disappointed. Rick shot a look at me, a look of pure contempt, as if I were the one who had wasted her time. The isolation in that moment was profound. I had the answer, the truth, but my voice, my senses, were considered worthless. It's a feeling that sinks deeper than any anchor. If you've ever felt this way, just leave a in the comments. We understand. Which brings me back to today. After his customers laughed, after he called me a beggar, I retreated. I walked to the end of a quiet fishing pier, away from the crowds, just to feel the familiar rhythm of the harbor and let the shame wash away. The sun was warm, the tide was going out, and the sounds were all as they should be. The deep thrum of the Staten Island ferry, the distant horn of a tugboat, the cries of the gulls fighting over a fisherman's scraps. And then I heard the city lights pull away. I know its engine signature the way a mother knows her child's voice. A smooth, powerful, almost arrogant purr. It headed out toward the Statue of Liberty, fading into the harbor's chorus. I sat there for maybe 20 minutes, just listening, just breathing. And then, something changed. It was a skipped beat in the heart of the harbor, a tiny flaw in the symphony that only I could hear. The sound of that specific engine, Rick's engine, faltered. It sputtered. It was a sick metallic cough that echoed across the water. And then, nothing. A sudden, unnatural silence from a place where there should have been noise. I lifted my head, my face turned toward the open water where the sound had died. The rest of the harbor traffic continued, oblivious. Ferries churned, helicopters whirred overhead. To everyone else, nothing was wrong. But to me, a hole had been torn in the soundscape. The city lights was a dead spot in the music. It was adrift, and I could feel the current it was caught in. The very same treacherous cross-current I had tried to warn Rick about, the one that runs like an invisible river past Governor's Island. I could feel it pulling his silent, helpless boat, pulling it directly into the path of something much, much bigger. A low, deep-throated vibration was growing steadily louder in the water, a sound I knew all too well. It was the sound of a massive container ship, unyielding and relentless, making its way out of the main shipping channel. And then, carried on the wind, a new sound began to drift across the water, faint at first, then sharper, shouting, the high, thin sound of pure panic. They were in terrible trouble, and nobody knew it but me. My heart was a trip hammer against my ribs. Every instinct, every fiber of my being was screaming. The shouts from the water were no longer just noise. They were individual threads of terror I could pick apart. A woman's high-pitched shriek, a man's desperate, cracking yell for help. These weren't the sounds of a fun day on the water gone slightly wrong. This was the sound of people who could feel the shadow of something immense and terrible falling over them. For a moment I was frozen. Why should I help? Why should I do anything for the man who had just thrown me away like garbage? The memory of his customers' laughter was still a fresh wound. Let them fix their own mess. The thought was bitter, a poison in my own heart. But then I heard another sound, under the shouting, the thin, terrified cry of a child. And that changed everything. This wasn't about Rick anymore. This was about the harbor, my harbor, and it was about to claim lives that didn't deserve to be lost. My legs were moving before my mind fully caught up. I fumbled for my cane, its tip clattering against the wooden planks as I hurried back toward the main dock. The air was thick with the smell of salt and diesel fuel. I could hear the urgent thrum of an approaching engine, faster and more purposeful than a pleasure craft. Coast Guard. My head snapped in its direction. They were coming, but they were flying blind, responding to a radio call. They didn't know what I knew. They couldn't feel the currents. They couldn't hear the specific location of that dead engine relative to the deep, guttural groan of the container ship that was getting louder by the second. They would be looking, not listening. They would lose precious time. As the Coast Guard auxiliary boat neared the pier, its wake slapping hard against the pilings, I stood at the edge, waving my cane frantically. The boat slowed, and a man's voice, sharp with impatience, cut through the engine noise. "Sir, you need to clear the area. This is an emergency." I didn't have time for pleasantries. I shouted over the roar, my voice raw with urgency. "The city lights! Her engine is dead. She's drifting into the main shipping channel directly in the path of the Evergreen Star." I could tell the container ship's name from the specific pitch of its horn sequence, a sound I'd known for years. There was a pause. I could feel the man's disbelief hanging in the air. "How in the world could you know that?" he yelled back. "I can't see a thing from here." "I don't need to see it," I roared, my voice cracking with the strain. "I can hear it. Her engine died at a dead drift in the Governor's Island cross current. You can't see it, but it's pulling her sideways, directly into that ship's path. You have maybe 3 minutes. Take me with you. I can get them out of there." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the slap of the water against his boat's hull, the distant scream of a gull. It felt like an eternity. I was just a blind beggar on a pier, shouting nonsense. He had every reason to ignore me, to tell me to get lost just as Rick had. My hands, gripping the handle of my cane, were trembling. Not from the cold wind, but from the sheer, agonizing fear that he would say no, that he would waste the last precious seconds they had. Then, his voice came back, tight and strained, but decisive. "Get in, now." The ride out was a violent symphony of sensation. The cold spray was like 1,000 needles on my face. The roar of the engine was so loud it vibrated in my teeth, in my bones. The boat bucked and slammed against the choppy water, and I held on with everything I had, my knuckles white. But through the chaos, I was mapping. I felt the change in the waves as we left the shelter of the pier. I could smell the shift in the air as we entered the wider channel. I was building a picture in my mind, a world made of sound and vibration and the feel of the wind. When the officer finally throttled down, the sudden quiet was jarring, and in that quiet, the sounds of panic from the city lights were terrifyingly close. We pulled alongside and the chaos was palpable. The smell of fear was a real thing, a sour, metallic scent in the air. I heard crying, the deckhand's voice babbling into a radio. I heard a man retching over the side. The Coast Guard officer helped me aboard. As my feet hit the deck of the city lights, a hush fell over the passengers. I could feel their eyes on me. The blind man, the beggar from the pier. Their confusion was a thick, heavy blanket. The young deckhand, the one who had sneered at me earlier, stumbled toward me, his face a mask of terror. "You? What are you going to do?" he stammered. I ignored him. I turned my head toward the helm, toward the sounds of Captain Rick groaning on the deck where he'd collapsed. My voice was low, steady, and held a command that surprised even me. "Take me to the wheel." He hesitated for a second, then led me through the stunned crowd. My hands found the helm. The plastic was cool beneath my trembling fingers. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the damp, salty air. I could feel it all. The boat's helpless drift, the pull of that treacherous current, and to my right, the deep, soul-shaking thrum of the container ship, a sound that was no longer distant, but terrifyingly close, a monster bearing down on us. Everyone was watching, waiting for me to fail. The weight of their lives was in my hands, hands that could not see. That's when everything changed, and no one ever looked at me the same way again. Would you have done the same? Seriously, just answer with yes or no, so I know you're here. My hands on the wheel weren't just holding on, they were reading. The cheap plastic was a conduit, channeling the story of the water directly into my palms. I felt the boat's lazy, sickening drift, the way the cross-current was trying to push our stern around. To my right, the thrumming of the Evergreen Star was no longer just a sound. It was a physical pressure against my skin, a vibration that resonated deep in my chest. It was a predator, and we were the wounded animal, helpless in its path. The silence on the boat was a fragile, crystalline thing, ready to shatter into a million pieces of panic at any moment. Every passenger, every crew member was holding their breath, their collective fear a heavy cloak in the air. They were staring at the blind beggar, the man they'd laughed at, who now held their lives in his unseeing hands. "The auxiliary engine," I said, my voice cutting through the tension. It was calm, devoid of the panic that was choking everyone else. "Is it functional?" The young deckhand, the one whose sneer was still etched into my memory, stammered beside me. Yes, but it's just for emergencies. It's not powerful enough to fight this current." His voice was thin, a reedy whisper of terror. He was reciting the manual, the rules he had learned. He was thinking in straight lines. The harbor doesn't work in straight lines. "I don't need to fight the current," I told him, keeping my head turned toward the growing roar of the container ship. "I need to dance with it. Start the auxiliary. Now." He scrambled to obey. A moment later, a smaller, less confident engine coughed to life. It was a pathetic sound compared to the main engine's roar, but it was enough. The vibration changed under my feet. The boat was no longer just a dead piece of driftwood. It had a pulse. "Full port on the rudder," I commanded. I felt the deckhand's hesitation. It was the wrong move, counterintuitive. Turning port would point our bow slightly more towards the container ship's path, not away from it. "Do it," I snapped, the authority in my voice surprising even me. The wheel resisted, then turned under my guidance. Half throttle forward, gentle. The boat lurched. The passengers gasped as one. For a terrifying second, it felt like we were lunging toward our doom. The deckhand cried out, "We're getting closer." He was right. We were. But I wasn't listening to him. I was listening to the water. I was feeling the precise moment the current, which had been our enemy, would become our ally. The massive wall of steel that was the Evergreen Star was now visible to them, a moving skyscraper blotting out the sky. I could feel the change in the air pressure as it approached. I could smell the hot metal and the diesel exhaust. Its horn blasted then, a deafening, soul-shaking sound that vibrated through every plank of our boat. A physical blow that made people scream. It was a final, terrible warning. "Now!" I shouted over the din. "Hard to starboard. Full throttle." The deckhand, now operating on pure adrenaline and a sliver of desperate faith, spun the wheel and slammed the throttle. The little auxiliary engine screamed in protest. For a heart-stopping moment, the boat seemed to hang in the water, caught between the current and our engine. Then it happened. The maneuver I had envisioned, the dance I had planned. Instead of fighting the powerful current head-on, we used our little burst of power to pivot, letting the current itself whip our stern around, swinging us out of the ship's direct path like a stone in a sling. The massive bow wave of the Evergreen Star caught us. It wasn't a gentle swell. It was a liquid wall. It lifted us, tilted us at an angle so steep I heard plates crash in the galley and people scream as they were thrown against the rails. But it didn't capsize us. It pushed us. It shoved us, violently but surely, into the safety of the parallel channel. The shadow of that colossal hull passed over us, a sudden cold darkness in the middle of a sunny day. And then it was gone. Silence returned, deeper and more profound than before. It was a silence filled with the sound of ragged breathing and the soft, stunned whimpers of relief. The only other sound was the gentle lapping of the waves against our hull. We were safe. We were floating in calm water. I eased the throttle back and straightened the wheel, my entire body trembling with the adrenaline crash. I had never been more exhausted or more alive. I turned my head toward the pier, still miles away, but as clear as a photograph in my mind's eye. "Let's go home," I said quietly. The journey back was a procession of ghosts. No one spoke. The tourists who had tittered at my expense were huddled together, wrapped in blankets and shock, their eyes fixed on me. They weren't looking at a beggar anymore. They were looking at something they couldn't comprehend. I felt the gaze of the Coast Guard officer on my back, a look of pure, unadulterated disbelief. I could hear his thoughts as clearly as if he'd spoken them. How? The young deckhand stood beside me at the helm, not as a guard, but as an apprentice. He watched my hands, watched how I made tiny, imperceptible adjustments to the wheel, not in response to anything he could see, but to the subtle shifts in wind and wake I could feel. He saw nothing, and yet he was finally learning to see everything. As we neared the dock, I could hear the commotion. The news had spread. A crowd had gathered. But I blocked it all out. I was focused on the final step. Docking a boat isn't about force. It's about permission. You have to ask the water to let you come to rest. I cut the engine at the perfect moment, letting our forward momentum carry us. I gave the wheel one last, gentle turn, letting the breeze on my cheek guide the bow. There was no loud bump, no jarring impact. The boat just kissed the pier, a whisper of rubber against wood, so soft that the people on the dock barely heard it. A perfect landing. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence from everyone aboard was my vindication. It was louder and more satisfying than any apology. Then the deckhand spoke, his voice cracking with awe and shame. How did you do that? You saved us. I turned my head toward the sound of his voice, toward the open water beyond, and took a deep breath of the salt air that was my birthright. I told you, I said, my voice just loud enough for him and for the now conscious Captain Rick, who was staggering toward us, his face a pale mask of humiliation. The tide was turning. If you've ever proven something to someone in silence, comment they understood too late. The air on the boat was thick with the ghosts of screams that had just vanished. In that ringing silence, the only sound was the gentle creak of the ropes as they took the boat's weight against the pier. The young deckhand was still staring at me, his mouth slightly open, the word "how" hanging unfinished in the air between us. He wasn't looking at a blind man. He was looking at a miracle, or maybe a monster, something his tidy, predictable world had no category for. He saw the result, but he couldn't comprehend the method, and it scared him. Then came the heavy, shuffling footsteps. Captain Rick. He stumbled forward, his face the color of old sailcloth, a roadmap of shame and disbelief etched onto his features. His expensive cologne was soured by the smell of sweat and fear. He stopped a few feet from me, his gaze fixed on my face as if trying to see past my dead eyes into the machinery of my mind. The entire boat, every passenger, the Coast Guard officer, the crowd on the pier, they were all waiting for this moment, for the apology, for the grand gesture of gratitude. It never came. Not really. He opened his mouth, and what came out was a choked, pathetic whisper. The engine. He couldn't even say it. He couldn't admit he had lost control, that he had been saved by the very man he'd called a beggar. He just shook his head, a gesture of complete and utter defeat, and turned away to stumble off his own boat, pushing past the silent crowd. His humiliation was his apology. It was louder and, in a way, more satisfying than any words he could have offered. The passengers began to disembark, a slow, dazed procession. They moved around me carefully, as if I were a sacred object, something fragile and powerful. A woman with a trembling hand tried to press a wad of cash into my palm. "For your trouble," she whispered, her voice thick with tears. I gently closed her fingers back over the money and shook my head. "I don't need your money," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I just need you to listen to the water." She looked at me, truly looked at me, for the first time, and nodded, a profound understanding dawning in her eyes. The last person to speak to me on the boat was the Coast Guard officer. He was a man of action, not words. He stood before me, his uniform crisp, his face weathered by the sun and the sea. He didn't ask how I did it. He didn't question or doubt. He just extended his hand. I found it, and his grip was firm, a gesture of pure professional respect. "I've been on this harbor for 15 years, he said, his voice low and steady. "I've never seen anything like that, ever. Thank you." That was it. No fanfare. Just a simple acknowledgement from one man of the sea to another. It meant more to me than 1,000 apologies from Rick. In the days that followed, the harbor was the same, but my place in it had changed. I still sat on my bench, feeling the sun on my face, mapping the world through its symphony of sounds. But the symphony had a new movement. The whispers I heard as people passed were different. The pity was gone, replaced by a hushed awe. "That's him," I'd hear, "the one they call the harbor's ghost." The mothers who used to pull their children away now pointed me out, telling a story that was already becoming a legend. The city lights went back into service a week later. I heard its engine, repaired and purring once more. But it wasn't Rick at the helm. It was the young deckhand. As the boat passed the pier where I sat, it slowed. Then, a single long blast from its horn echoed across the water. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a signal. It was a salute. I turned my head toward the sound and allowed myself a small, quiet smile. The sea doesn't care if you're rich or poor, sighted or blind. It doesn't listen to boasts or empty promises shouted from the helm of a gleaming boat. It's an ancient, powerful thing, and it only respects knowledge earned through patience. It responds to those who listen to its secrets, who feel its rhythms not just on the surface, but deep in their bones. Rick and his customers, they saw the harbor as a pretty picture, a backdrop for their lives. But when the picture turned deadly, they learned that the background can swallow you whole. In this world, it's not the one who talks the loudest who matters. It's the one who acts when everyone else is frozen in fear. I saved them. I know I did. But as I sit here feeling the tide turn once again, a question lingers in my mind, carried on the salty breeze. I wonder, do they truly see me now for who I am? Or do they only respect the man they needed in their moment of terror? I wonder if they remember me for what I did, or if they just respect me now because they had no other choice. Read this ending and comment with a word that defines you when you were doubted.